I am preparing for the GMAT Focus Edition. The last time I took the GMAT, I scored a 99 percentile score. But the test format at the time was very different. On GMAT Focus, I am aiming to equal or beat my past GMAT score. Today is day 8 of my GMAT prep. I am going to start with a quick performance analysis of my data insights practice session from day 7. I also plan to get into another data insights practice session after that. All of that is in line with the short study plan that I had put together on day 7 of my GMAT prep. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to refer to the data insights section as just the data section going forward. Let me give you a quick recap of my practice session from day 7. Referring back to my notes from day 7 of my GMAT prep, I had a 45-minute long practice session focused on the data insights section on day 7. I answered 17 questions in that time frame. Of those 17 questions, I had answered 16 questions correctly. So overall, my accuracy was alright. That said, my velocity was actually lagging pretty badly. The final GMAT test expects you to answer 20 data insights questions within a time frame of 45 minutes. I could only get to 17. So obviously, I need to work on improving both my accuracy and velocity on this section as I work towards the final GMAT exam. Based on the numbers, it is quite clear to me that improving velocity is where I need to focus my attention as far as my practice sessions for the data section are concerned. Now, getting into the plan for today, I have my notes from the practice session as you were seeing on the screen a few seconds back. I also have the practice questions tab of the online question bank open on my screen right here. To begin with, I will just focus on thinking about my practice experience from yesterday, which is day 7, and identifying what I can do better going forward. Let's go. Alright. So I've spent about 40 minutes going through notes of my practice session from day 7 and identifying my learnings from that. Note that when I'm doing my performance analysis, I do not look at the solutions. For questions which I answered incorrectly in a practice session, I will retry those questions at least 2 or 3 times on different days as I go through my GMAT prep. And I do that while trying to not even look at the solution by mistake. In fact, I go to the extent of ensuring that I don't even look at which of the 5 options is the right answer so that I'm not cheating myself while going through GMAT practice. I'll make a separate video on why I do that and how you can benefit from replicating the same behavior at a future date. For now, I have made a note of several points of improvement. I have broadly divided them into 3 categories: things I should do more of, things I should do less of, and any major approach or mindset improvements that I need to make going forward. I don't want to get into too much detail here because these points are very customized to me, but let me just focus on the top 3 things just so you understand how I approach this. For what it's worth, some of this might also benefit you. First, I want to track answer options more efficiently when I am attempting a data sufficiency question. In describing this, I will just assume that you are familiar with the format of a data sufficiency question and are aware that any data sufficiency question on the GMAT has the same exact 5 answer options. To identify the right answer option, you will first try to solve the question using data point 1. Then you will try to do it using data point 2, and then finally you will try to answer using both data point 1 and 2. This point of feedback here is actually just a reminder for myself. There is a much more elegant way to track your answer options on data sufficiency questions. I was so lost in the novelty of all the new types of data insights questions that I was attempting that I forgot that there is a much cleaner way of approaching data sufficiency questions. The second point of feedback I have for myself is that abbreviations may not stay consistent throughout an entire question on the GMAT. I don't want to give away details of specific GMAT questions, so I will try to explain this with an easy to understand example. Let's say you were reading a long passage about the DC Comics character, Superman. The first paragraph simply describes logical relationships between Superman and his family members on planet Earth. In the second paragraph, the passage transitions to talking about Superman's relationship with his home planet, Krypton. In doing so, the passage starts to refer to Superman as son of Krypton. In the third paragraph, you are reading sentences about Man of Steel, which, by the way, is just another name for Superman. The problem is that the same GMAT passage has used 3 different terms to refer to the same entity. If I was reading this passage for the first time in my life and I had zero knowledge about Superman from pop culture, it would consume my brain's processing power to connect the dots between those 3 different terms that the passage was using. It is a given that you will run into GMAT passages of this nature. The only difference is that the subject of the passage will be something much more exotic. For example, the passage might be talking about different types of mushrooms such as Octospora humosa and Daldinia concentrica. If you are feeling instantly bugged by those terms, that is exactly the feeling that the GMAT is going for. The test wants you to feel stumped. One simple way I get around situations like this is by using abbreviations for complex terms as I'm taking notes. So going back to the Superman example, I would use different abbreviations to refer to the 3 different names used for Superman, and then use some kind of note or lines or whatever to signify that all of those terms are actually referring to the same exact entity. This specific point of feedback in my notes is just a reminder so that I am mentally prepared to run into situations like this while I am practicing GMAT questions or taking the final GMAT. The third point of feedback I have for myself is to be aware of situations where I am feeling rushed into selecting an option and to forcibly pause, take a deep breath, and a few extra seconds before making a final choice on any given question. This is because there were at least 2 occasions during my practice session that I rushed into selecting an answer option. And when the question you are attempting requires you to reason through a lot of qualitative logic, rushing into selecting an answer option can often lead to unnecessary mistakes that could have very well been avoided if you had spent a few extra seconds on that question. In addition to the points of feedback I have for me from solving the questions, I also noticed some quirks about the online question bank. As I had mentioned on day 7, I am not planning to spend time figuring out the features and quirks of the online question bank till I have given the first practice test in a couple days. I will just brute force my way through it, and I will work on using the online question bank better in future study sessions. With all of that said, I am now going to get into my practice session for day 8. Once again, my focus today is the data insight section, and I will try to incorporate the 3 points of feedback that I just described. Let's get going. Alright. So this is 45 minutes later. You might be seeing me smile, but I guarantee you that on the inside I am a severely broken man. My practice session outcomes are pretty abysmal, to say the least. Maybe I should just stop giving people advice on the GMAT and go take a spiritual journey to find happiness in life instead. Jokes aside, here are my completely unfiltered practice session outcomes. So, 45 minutes of time in total. 13 questions attempted. Remember that on the final GMAT test in the data insight section, we are going to have to answer 20 questions in 45 minutes. And today I was only able to answer 13 questions in that same time frame. So I guess I am halfway there. Of those 13 questions, I answered 4 questions incorrectly. And that leads to the following metrics. From an accuracy standpoint, I stand at 70% accuracy, and from a velocity standpoint, I took about 3 minutes 30 seconds per question. The only thing I can say is that this is actually a terrible outcome. Some quick commentary before I get into performance analysis. In the first minute after I started the session timer, I actually found myself going entirely blank for almost 1 to 1.5 minutes. I was literally just loitering and staring at the screen. I probably read 1 sentence in that entire minute. The point I'm trying to make is that I did not start the practice session on a good note. Second, Sometime during the 45-minute time frame, I actually had a family member knock at the door of my room because they were having a health situation. Thankfully, it was not an emergency, so I was able to continue with my study session, but that interruption did break my flow for a few seconds. Now, that is nothing major, but one takeaway for me is to inform my family members before I start to engage in these practice sessions with an active timer. Third, if you did not already notice this in the fast forward section, I want to call out that even as I was solving questions using a blue pen, I was regularly analyzing and making notes about my mental state or specific uncertainties or specific patterns that I was noticing while going through the practice questions. And these are notes that I usually make in red ink. This behavior of making feedback notes even as you are solving practice problems is something that I would generally recommend because it is another way for you to identify potential for improvement as you go through performance analysis at a later point. Finally, one thing that might actually explain my abysmal practice session metrics is the fact that it appears that most of the questions that I was thrown by the online question bank today actually belong to the multi-source reasoning question type. So if I were to just click through here for a second, you see that there are a bunch of questions, I think actually all 13 of them, which happen to be of the multi-source reasoning type. And that is telling me two things. Number one, questions of this type might be exceptionally time-taking for me in particular. And number two, the metrics I'm seeing from my practice session today might actually not be very bad in the larger context. The reason I make that second point there is because on the final GMAT test, multi-source reasoning will only account for some of the questions on the data insight section. So any time that I lose there or that I spend extra on multi-source reasoning questions, I can probably make up by solving the other types of questions faster. Finally, I will go back to the point that I have not spent time trying to understand how the online question bank works or how it generates questions for a given practice session. Clearly, it doesn't do a good job of mixing different question types. We will figure out if there's a way to get around that at a later point. With all of that said, it is now time for some unfiltered and ruthless performance analysis. All right. So that was about 45 minutes of performance analysis. In the interest of time, I will touch upon only the top 3 things that I'm going to try to improve in my future data insights practice sessions. First, I want to be prepared to watch out for wordplay on data insights questions, just like I do on verbal questions as well. Let me quickly describe what I mean by wordplay. You might have a data insights question with a passage that says Mercedes offers a full self-drive feature on its cars, which can drive cars on the highway without manual intervention. On the other hand, when you get to the question underneath the passage, the verbiage might use the phrase highways and city roads instead of just highways. This is minor, but in my experience, it often leads to errors that could have been easily avoided on the test. The reason I think this note is important for me is because psychologically, I only expect to see such wordplay on the verbal section of the GMAT. The data insight section is obviously a feature of the new GMAT Focus Edition. As a result, I don't have clear expectations of what to expect and not expect on this section. I want to train my mind to adjust my expectations so that I watch out for such wordplay on the data insight section as well going forward. Today, of the 4 mistakes I made, one was actually the result of wordplay exactly like that. I do not want to get into the details of the question because I don't want to spoil it for you. But in my case, it was something between question number 6 and I think question number 9 on the test. So it was very likely question number 8. The second thing I want to improve on in my next study session is to do better at dealing with information overwhelm. By information overwhelm, I am referring to situations where the GMAT will throw questions at you that will have so much information that it will be hard for you to track what is going on in the question in the first place. I want to adjust my mindset so that I am able to deal with situations like that a little more proactively. The reason this is very important is because one missed piece of information can lead to multiple errors downstream. In my case, 2 of the 4 errors I made today were a result of exactly this. In fact, I got lucky with a couple questions because the missed information did not directly impact the answer that I arrived at. Otherwise, I would have ended up answering 5 to 6 questions incorrectly out of the 13 that I attempted today. I think information overwhelm is also a specific feature of multi-source reasoning questions because these type of questions throw a ton of information at you. There are tables, text, graphs, and whatnot. I was finding myself overwhelmed with information at several points during the practice session. So much so that after I was done reading a question, I could not even recall the different pieces of information which had been provided earlier. Going forward, when I feel overwhelmed like that, I will test whether a mindset change can fix it. Specifically, when I feel overwhelmed the next time, I will start graphically organizing the information in writing instead of doing it in my head. That might help fix things, we will find out. The third thing that I want to incorporate in my practice sessions going forward is something relatively tactical. I will set the time limit of all my practice sessions at 47 minutes instead of 45 minutes henceforth. Both in today's practice session and in yesterday's practice session, I had set the time limit to 45 minutes. As a result, when I got to the 44-minute mark, I stopped reading any new question that was on the screen at that point. Setting the time limit at 47 minutes will give me enough headroom to finish any question that has already shown up on the screen before the 45-minute mark. Of course, this is just for practice because I want to make sure that I am also practicing solving through different types of problems for an entire 45-minute period continuously on a regular basis. Alright, so that is all for today. As you can see on my screen, I know roughly exactly what I plan to do on day 9 and day 10 of my GMAT prep. I have not made plans for what I'm going to do on the days following that. My plans for day 9 and day 10 are consistent with the study plan that I had made on day 7 of my preparation. I know that I had originally planned to also practice some quant problems on day 8, but given that I already have quant on schedule for day 9, what I'm going to do is just skip past this for the time being. Before we conclude, remember to subscribe and bell the channel. If you have any questions for me, you will find an Ask Me Anything link in the description below. You can also troll my practice session performance in the comments if that gives you pleasure. Otherwise, have a fun time preparing for the GMAT and laugh your way through any horrifying practice course you might get. It is a good story to tell your kids. Actually, on second thought, don't tell them stories about the GMAT unless you are trying to get rid of them, because they might just go adopt someone else as their parents after that. See you in the next video.